Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. The air in the courtroom was cold, but not as cold as the silence that wrapped around Marilyn like a damp blanket. Her eyes fixed on the wooden paneling before her. Not because it held any answers, but because looking elsewhere would mean meeting the smug gaze of the man she once called her husband, and the woman he now held like a trophy. Laughter had started low, almost like a cough from Derek, then grew into a full chuckle as Chloe leaned in to whisper something into his ear. Marilyn didn't flinch. Her breath was measured, her expression unreadable, but inside her chest a quiet storm brewed, old but not yet spent. That morning she had tied her headscarf twice, not because it wouldn't hold, but because something in her spirit told her she would need the second not to keep her dignity from slipping. The courtroom clerk called out her name in full, Marilyn Adiwal, and it rang like a bell toll in a sleepy village. She stood up slowly, as though rising from years of emotional weight, not a wooden bench. Her lawyer, a small but sharp woman named Tammy, gently touched her elbow, a signal to breathe, not speak. There was power in silence, and Marilyn wore hers like an armor forged in heartbreak. As she stood, her gaze briefly brushed Derek's. He grinned, one corner of his mouth twisted like a secret he thought he'd buried too deep for justice to find. Chloe crossed her legs and leaned back, her bright green gown screaming for attention. If they thought this courtroom was a stage, and she the tragic clown, they were yet to meet the scriptwriter that life had assigned to today's episode. The truth didn't come wrapped in loud declarations or explosive confrontations. It came slowly, like dew settling on dry earth, gently at first, then soaking everything with clarity. Marilyn hadn't always been quiet. In her younger years, she had been the one to shout in traffic when someone cut in. She laughed with her whole belly, sometimes snorted, and once danced barefoot in the rain just to prove to Derek that adulthood didn't mean the death of joy. But time, marriage, and Derek's growing contempt had taught her that silence was not weakness, it was observation. And so, when the first signs of Chloe started creeping into her marriage like an uninvited guest, she didn't raise her voice. She began to collect moments like receipts, the lipstick stain on a wine glass, the phantom perfume that lingered on his shirts, the hotel loyalty card tucked under his car seat. It wasn't suspicion, it was knowledge taking shape. And knowledge, unlike suspicion, did not tremble. Derek had stopped pretending by their 12th anniversary. He no longer made excuses for being late. Instead, he brought his silence home like a stray dog and fed it beside the dining table. The food Marilyn made went untouched, and his phone became an extension of his spine, always in his hand, never in her view. Chloe had youth, laughter, and Derek's attention. But what Marilyn had was history and a deep understanding that when betrayal grows fat, it never thinks the door will shut on it. She didn't plan revenge. She prepared her truth, watered it, gave it air, and waited for its roots to hold. It was Derek who had filed first. Like a man throwing out a ladder after climbing it, he arrived at the courthouse dressed in a navy blue suit, flanked by Chloe, who wore sunglasses indoors and walked like the aisle was her runway. His petition read like a soap opera script, accusations of emotional abandonment, bitterness, and a refusal to grow with him. He wanted the house, the cars, and even the dog they never had time to name. Marilyn read the papers in silence. She folded them with a calmness that terrified Tammy. That night, she didn't cry. She steamed rice, sat by the window, and wrote down a list of all the properties registered in both their names. She added the business accounts, the suspicious transfers, and the phone calls he made when he thought she was asleep. Chloe had once posted a picture online, a blurry selfie in what she captioned his kingdom. But Marilyn knew that couch, those throw pillows. It was their guest house in Alaro, a house Derek told her they couldn't afford to renovate. The lie stuck out like a red thread in white fabric. And so Marilyn began to stitch her case together, one detail at a time. She gathered voice notes, printouts, and statements from Derek's former assistant, who had once borrowed transport fare from her when Derek refused to pay his staff. The truth didn't shout. It collected itself. The day they finally walked into the courtroom together, the difference was loud without sound. Derek strutted like a man walking into a boardroom he built, confident the world would tilt in his favor. Chloe followed, chewing gum softly, her heels clicking with arrogance. Marilyn arrived in a navy blue dress, nothing fancy but crisp, ironed with care, and a head wrap that matched her poise. Her expression wasn't bitter. It was composed, like a woman who knew the tides were shifting beneath feet that thought they were planted on marble. Chloe greeted the court clerk like she was familiar with the system, called the bailiff dear, and tossed her braids behind her shoulder. Derek laughed twice, once before the hearing began, and once when Tammy introduced the first exhibit, a printout of a joint account drained 3 weeks after he filed for divorce. "She's just trying to hold on," Chloe whispered loud enough for Marilyn to hear. But Marilyn didn't blink. She stared ahead like a woman watching an old building crumble. No surprise, only a solemn respect for what once stood. When the judge finally adjusted his glasses and opened the case file, even the air seemed to pause. Derek leaned back with a half smile. Chloe crossed her legs again. "But Marilyn?" She leaned forward slightly, the way one does when they know the page that's about to be turned will change everything. The first time Marilyn saw Chloe in person, it wasn't in a courtroom or in a dream thick with betrayal. It was in the most unexpected of places, a pharmacy queue on a rain-soaked Tuesday. The clouds had been moody that morning, and the gutters outside the plaza overflowed like unspoken secrets. Marilyn had been standing behind a teenage boy who was nervously clutching a prescription when she heard the laughter, the type that wasn't loud, but full of someone who thought the world revolved around them. Chloe was standing by the counter, chewing gum, phone pressed to her ear, with the kind of confidence that suggested she had never begged for love a day in her life. She wore tight jeans and a crop top that didn't suit the weather, and when she turned, she bumped into Marilyn without realizing it. The scent of her perfume, too sweet, too loud, wrapped around Marilyn like an insult, clinging long after Chloe was gone. That moment didn't birth hatred in Marilyn. Instead, it marked the first time she truly grasped what she was dealing with, a woman who didn't steal love in the dark, but flaunted it under the sun. That night, Marilyn didn't tell Derek what she saw. Instead, she opened her journal and wrote down a simple line. The snake no longer hides in the grass. It now wears heels and walks in daylight. It was no longer about a broken heart. It was about an insult to her intelligence. Derek had become a stranger long before Chloe arrived, but her presence made the transformation complete. It was as if he had been waiting for a reason to shed the last layers of decency, and Chloe gave him permission. He started speaking to Marilyn like she was an intern in his office, someone he tolerated for the sake of protocol. Dishes were left unwashed, calls went unanswered, and when Marilyn mentioned the electricity bill once, he smirked and said, "I'm not your flatmate. Don't report utilities to me." The words stung, not because they were sharp, but because they came from a man whose back she had massaged through 2 surgeries and whose business proposals she had typed with her own laptop on nights he couldn't afford data. Once, when they were still pretending to be okay, she had surprised him with a framed certificate of incorporation for the small real estate business he had dreamed of launching. She remembered his eyes welling with tears. That was a different man. The one who now kept his phone face down at dinner and left receipts from restaurants he swore he'd never been to. When Chloe entered the picture, he began to do something Marilyn hadn't expected. He started rewriting their history. To others, he said she had become distant. To Chloe, he said she had lost her spark. And to himself, in the silence of his own growing guilt, he probably said nothing at all. That silence is what hurt the most, the part of him that didn't even try to justify the betrayal. Chloe, on her part, wasn't hiding either. She pranced into Marilyn's orbit like a mosquito on a humid night, persistent, irritating, and hard to ignore. She posted photos of dinners Derek claimed were work meetings, made inside jokes online about old wives who don't understand new love, and even called Marilyn's number once by mistake, or perhaps on purpose. The call had been brief. Chloe had chuckled and said, "Oops, wrong Marilyn," then hung up. It wasn't just cruelty, it was the art of mockery, served cold. But what Chloe didn't understand was that Marilyn had stopped being a victim the moment she realized the game wasn't about affection, it was about control. Derek didn't just want a new woman, he wanted a new version of himself that didn't carry the guilt of a failing marriage. And Chloe was his mirror, his proof that he could still be adored. But Marilyn was not interested in being part of their theater. She was building something quiet, something precise. Tammy had once told her, "It's not enough to know the truth. You have to present it in a way that makes silence impossible." That sentence became her anchor. She began gathering more than memories. She gathered legal proof, patterns of financial movement, overlapping dates, fake invoices, and voice notes where Derek admitted to changing account passwords. She didn't rant. She didn't beg. She collected. Stats, free clients unekrasted, Richter Fricksoris, Johold Pentolas, Fenslichen Spritas eat cervical likeste. Fordrek Ricks at Smets Machet at Porgeta feisted. Thanks to collected, Bishilidas Weathers Rect in the Size Ricks a Salmas Letterfist. Forgeta View the Forpota Concert at Third Prep. When Derek finally served her the divorce papers, it felt less like betrayal and more like punctuation, an inevitable full stop in a sentence that had long lost meaning. The petition read like a badly scripted novella, with exaggerated claims of emotional neglect and a fabricated story of Marilyn's spiritual control. But what struck her most was the part where he requested the Alaro guest house, 2 of their 3 cars, and a share in a piece of land that had originally been bought with her father's inheritance. She didn't weep. She didn't curse. Instead, she brewed a cup of tea, opened her file drawer, and began separating documents into categories: financial, emotional, and legal. There were receipts Derek had signed in her name without permission. There were bank alerts that showed withdrawals at times he claimed to be on business trips. There was even an email from a developer confirming Derek's interest in transferring full ownership of a property to Chloe, backdated to before the divorce filing. Marilyn didn't want to win out of bitterness. She wanted the truth to stand like a monument. When she arrived at Tammy's office the next morning, she carried a small suitcase. Tammy looked up and asked, "Traveling?" Marilyn smiled faintly and said, "No, I just brought every brick they tried to bury me with. We're going to build a case." And in that moment, even Tammy knew this wouldn't be a trial. It would be a reckoning. The courtroom, when viewed through the lens of pain, doesn't look like justice. It looks like theater, complete with a cast, stage, script, and audience. Marilyn sat there quietly as Derek's lawyer, a man with a smirk permanently attached to his face, strutted around like a peacock in litigation. His words were tailored to inflict subtle damage, cloaked in legal terms that didn't scream but cut clean. He called Marilyn emotionally uncooperative, possessive, and financially parasitic. With each sentence, Derek smiled like a man watching his alibi being crafted in real time. Chloe, seated beside him in a coral blazer 2 sizes too loud, leaned in to whisper something, then stifled a giggle. It wasn't the first time she laughed that week. Marilyn didn't look at her, not once. Instead, she placed her left hand gently on her lap and used her right to slide forward Exhibit D, a statement of account showing how Derek had drained their shared savings account within 3 days of submitting his divorce petition. The room didn't go silent because of the document itself, but because of the sudden shift in energy. Tammy rose, calm but firm, and began presenting the timeline, aligning dates, receipts, and travel logs. Derek's posture stiffened, his smirk now wearing cracks like old paint. Chloe crossed her legs slower than usual, her bracelet clinking against the desk with nervous rhythm. The judge, a silver-haired man with deep creases of fatigue and wisdom around his eyes, adjusted his glasses and asked for clarification. Tammy didn't answer with noise. She answered with facts. Not stories. Not suspicions. Cold, irreversible facts. And that was the day the courtroom stopped being their playground. What people often forget is that betrayal doesn't always break a person. It sometimes builds them. Marilyn, in her soft and deliberate way, had spent months constructing a wall of evidence so detailed that even Derek's lawyer began to stumble over his words. She had acquired voice recordings, yes, but also transaction logs showing Chloe receiving monthly stipends from a joint account Derek claimed hadn't been touched in months. One by one, the truth came out, not in chaos, but like threads pulled gently from a carefully woven lie. Chloe's name appeared in documents she never signed for. Derek's handwriting popped up in unauthorized transfers, and business registration papers proved that Marilyn had been listed as a co-owner in ventures she had never even heard of. At one point, Derek stood and objected, claiming that the marriage had been dead long before Chloe came along. The judge asked him a simple question. If it was dead, why did you keep using her name to fund your life? There was no answer. Only shifting feet and eyes that no longer held arrogance. Chloe turned to whisper something, but Derek didn't respond. For the first time, there was distance between them, not physical, but something that felt like a silent recognition of impending consequences. Marilyn still hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was simply unveiling. One layer at a time. Like a sculptor brushing away the dust to reveal what had always been underneath. Outside the courtroom, rumors began to stir. Colleagues who once sided with Derek quietly deleted their congratulatory comments on Chloe's posts. Friends who had told Marilyn to let it go now sent subtle messages asking if she was okay. Tammy had warned her this would happen, that people don't like the truth until it benefits them. But Marilyn wasn't after sympathy. Her silence wasn't a plea, it was a statement. The local gossip blogs caught wind of the case, posting headlines like Elmond Creek's real estate king accused of fraud by wife and secret girlfriend linked to property scheme. Chloe went offline for a few days, then returned with a filtered selfie and a caption that read, "Unbothered queens, don't address noise." But beneath the photo was a quiet war of comments, some hailing her boldness, others dragging her for standing beside a man whose empire was clearly cracking. Marilyn saw the post, smiled slightly, and moved on. She didn't have time to engage in digital mud fights. She was focused on facts, not followers. That weekend, while sipping tea on her balcony, she received a call from one of Derek's former contractors. He sounded hesitant, but said, "I just thought you should know. He made me backdate a lot of those invoices. I still have copies." Marilyn didn't gasp. She simply said thank you, took his number, and added his name to her growing list of truth-bearers. Slowly, the wall around Derek's story began to crumble, not from force, but from truth, simply standing still long enough to be seen. Chloe had started attending the hearings less frequently. She claimed she was unwell, but everyone in that courtroom knew the truth had become too loud for her to sit beside. Derek looked more alone with each session, the suit he once wore like armor now sagging with creases of worry. Tammy continued presenting evidence, not aggressively, but methodically. Like a librarian returning books to their rightful shelves. One by one, the story unraveled. Derek's image, once polished and persuasive, now shimmered with cracks, and yet he kept hoping Marilyn would give up, that she would crumble under the weight of her own pain. But what he didn't understand was that this wasn't about pain anymore, it was about restoration. Marilyn wasn't looking for pity or applause. She was rebuilding her name, brick by brick, from the rubble he thought would bury her. The day the court requested a forensic audit of all Derek's properties, Chloe's name appeared on 2 title deeds that listed her as domestic partner. It was then Marilyn turned, for the first time, and looked directly at Chloe, not with hatred, not with triumph, but with the calm of someone who had finally outgrown the room. That moment was the closest she came to gloating, and even that look was more graceful than the most expensive apology. Derek glanced sideways, caught the exchange, and for the first time blinked rapidly, as if smoke had entered his eyes. But there was no fire around him, only the truth, finally burning without mercy. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a man unravel slowly, not through confrontation or chaos, but through the quiet sting of exposure. Derek had begun coming to court earlier than usual, not because he was suddenly eager for justice, but because he no longer trusted what would be said if he wasn't there to spin it. The confidence that once hung around his shoulders like a designer jacket now looked more like a borrowed suit, ill-fitting and out of place. His gait had lost its swing. His voice, once boisterous in business meetings and backyard parties, now had a falter tucked between every sentence. He no longer looked at Chloe during court sessions. Their seating gap had widened not by feet, but by realization. Chloe still attempted the occasional smirk, especially when Marilyn entered the courtroom, wearing something tasteful and understated, but even her laughter now sounded forced, like a comedian trying to land a joke in a room that had already seen the punchline. Derek's lawyer began shifting tactics, asking for extensions, delaying responses, as though time could change the direction of the wind. But Tammy stayed consistent. Every day she walked into that courtroom with a single briefcase, but it might as well have been an avalanche in disguise. She wasn't loud, but her presence had weight. She handled Marilyn's case like a woman rearranging broken glass, carefully, with gloves of logic and sleeves of evidence. The audit report came in a week later, thick as a dictionary and twice as damaging. Inside it lay not just numbers and graphs, but timelines that formed a story no one could escape from. Marilyn's financial records, once dismissed as paranoid tracking, now read like prophecy. Chloe's name surfaced again, this time tied to a suspicious loan granted by a shell company Derek had quietly registered 3 months before the affair became public. The report revealed double entries, asset misstatements, and worst of all, a concealed document attempting to transfer ownership of a property already under litigation. The judge paused halfway through reading, removed his glasses, and exhaled. It wasn't just disappointment, it was the sound of someone forced to acknowledge a pattern they hoped wasn't real. Derek tried to interrupt. He stood, hands slightly shaking, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, a clerical error, and that his intentions were never malicious. Chloe fidgeted in her seat, her hands gripping her purse like it held her dignity. She looked up only once, her lips pressed in a line so thin it barely existed. Tammy didn't respond to Derek's outburst. She simply opened her folder and placed a signed letter from a notary on the judge's table, confirming that Marilyn's signature had been forged on at least 2 investment documents. The court clerk coughed, perhaps out of discomfort, and Derek sat back down slowly, visibly deflating. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if the truth had closed in like thick fog, leaving no space for escape. That night, Chloe didn't return to Derek's house. She went to her cousin's place across town and turned off her phone for 3 days. Her Instagram was wiped clean, every post, every caption, every filtered smile. In her place was a single black screen with the words, "Taking time to heal. Please respect my space." But healing wasn't what she sought. It was distance from the scandal she had helped build with manicured hands and careless laughter. Marilyn saw the post because someone sent it to her. She didn't laugh. She didn't even sigh. Instead, she opened her kitchen cabinet and pulled out the tin of tea leaves her mother had gifted her a year before she passed. She brewed a pot and sat in her living room, the same room where Derek once danced barefoot with her to a slow song on a power-out night. She didn't try to remember that moment fondly or bitterly. She just acknowledged it like a page in a book, read, marked, and turned. Her strength didn't come from revenge. It came from clarity, from knowing she hadn't stooped, from the realization that you could drown in hurt or float in truth, and she had chosen the latter. Tammy called later that evening, with a tone Marilyn had never heard in her voice before. "Judgment is scheduled for Friday," she said. "We'll know everything then." Marilyn nodded, eyes fixed on the tea swirling in her cup. The final act was coming, not with fireworks, but with the slow unraveling of lies dressed as love. Friday arrived wearing a kind of silence that didn't need an introduction. The courtroom wasn't as full as the earlier days, but the few who came sat forward in their seats, sensing something irreversible was about to occur. Derek looked exhausted, his tie loose, his shirt collar a little too wrinkled for a man who used to iron his socks. Chloe arrived 10 minutes late, her face devoid of makeup, her walk slower than usual. They sat apart not just physically, but as two people finally realizing that the fairy tale they built was made from borrowed lines and broken trust. Marilyn entered in a soft purple dress, her hair pinned neatly, and a pair of flat shoes that made no noise when she walked. She looked neither triumphant nor angry, just present, grounded, and impossibly calm. When the judge entered and took his seat, the room felt like it was holding its breath. He began reading from the report summary, his voice steady but heavy with finality. He outlined the misappropriation of marital assets, the forgery, and the misuse of joint funds. His words were surgical, stripping Derek's case bare with each sentence. Chloe blinked repeatedly, her lips trembling as the words "subject to further investigation" reached her ears. Derek leaned back, his hand on his forehead, eyes wide and unfocused. When the judge declared full asset restitution to Marilyn, along with exclusive rights to the Alaro guest house and their joint shares, it was not applause that followed, but silence, profound and echoing. Marilyn didn't smile. She simply bowed her head slightly, as if to whisper a quiet thank you to whatever dignity she had fought to keep. Chloe wept silently. Derek's mouth moved, but no words came out. And in that moment, the woman they had laughed at, belittled, and underestimated stood taller than anyone else in the room, not because she won, but because she never lost herself. When people think about victory, they often imagine balloons, cheers, and a rush of euphoria that lifts the soul like a song. But for Marilyn, that Friday evening offered none of those. The judgment had been delivered, the truth spoken aloud in a room that once held nothing but doubt and suppressed giggles at her expense. She didn't feel like celebrating. She felt like breathing. Long, deep, silent breaths that weren't choked by pretense or expectation. As the courtroom slowly emptied, she remained seated, her palms folded gently on her lap, eyes cast on the same wood-grain panel she had stared at on the first day. Tammy tapped her shoulder lightly and gave a proud smile, the kind that held both relief and admiration. Marilyn stood, adjusted her dress with calm dignity, and made her way out, each step firm but unhurried. Outside the court, the air held a stillness so thick it could be bottled. No questions from reporters, no whispers from spectators, only the hush of consequence unfolding behind them. Chloe had already left, head bowed and pace quick. Derek remained inside, slouched in the defendant's chair like a statue left behind in a room that no longer needed its shadow. He had nothing to say, no one waiting, not even Chloe, who once glowed in his presence like a firefly too sure of its light. That glow was gone now, dimmed by exposure. Marilyn didn't turn back. She didn't need to. Whatever pieces were broken behind her were not hers to gather. The ride home was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Tammy, who was still marveling at how the case had unraveled. "You didn't just win, Marilyn. You unmasked him," she said, eyes fixed on the road but thoughts still wrapped around the courtroom's final scene. Marilyn gave a soft smile, the kind that barely lifted the cheeks, but told of a soul exhaling years of held breath. "I didn't unmask him," she replied softly. "He just ran out of lies to wear." Her voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't triumphant either. It was settled, like rainwater finding its way into the soil. When they reached her street, Marilyn asked the driver to stop a few meters from the gate. She wanted to walk the last part home alone. The pavement, cracked and uneven, felt familiar under her flats. The old neem tree near the gate rustled like it had something to say, and the distant sound of a neighbor's baby crying reminded her that life, in all its unpredictable tones, was still playing. As she opened her gate and stepped into the compound, she paused, not from fatigue, but to take in the evening's golden light spilling across the walls of her home. It looked different now, not because the building had changed, but because she had. The place no longer held echoes of Derek's footsteps or shadows of late-night fights. It was her home again, hers to fill with peace, with purpose, and maybe one day with laughter that didn't carry pain. Later that night, as twilight dipped into darkness, Marilyn sat in her living room surrounded by silence thick enough to hear her own heartbeat. She turned off her phone, not out of avoidance, but because she didn't want anything disturbing the serenity she had earned. On her lap rested the old journal she had kept during the hardest days of her marriage, a battered leather book filled with scribbled prayers, clipped receipts, and questions she had once asked herself like chants in a temple. She flipped through it slowly, page after page, reading fragments of her own heartbreak like someone surveying ruins after a storm. And then she reached the final page, blank, untouched. She picked up her pen, paused, and wrote, "I lost a man and gained myself. I carried silence and birthed clarity. I was mocked in daylight but crowned in stillness." She stopped writing, closed the book gently, and leaned back. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A generator sputtered to life. A child laughed. The world had not paused for her pain, and it wouldn't celebrate her triumph either, but she was fine with that. In that quiet, she found something more sacred than noise, peace. And peace, she realized, was not the absence of conflict. It was the victory that comes when you know you didn't lose yourself while fighting for what was already yours. Across town, Chloe stood in front of her bedroom mirror, wiping off the last traces of mascara that had streaked down during her quiet sobbing. She had spent the hours after the judgment in her cousin's room, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that things would blow over. But they hadn't. Her name was now attached to legal documents, her social media filled with people questioning her role, her judgment, and her morality. Derek had called her twice. She hadn't answered, not because she was angry, but because for the first time she realized she was no longer the prize. She was the proof. Proof of his fall, proof of her own naivety, proof that being chosen didn't always mean being valued. Her phone lit up again. Derek. She let it ring. Outside, the streetlights flickered as if struggling to stay lit, much like her confidence. She leaned against the wall, pulled her knees to her chest, and whispered something she'd never said aloud. "I thought I was winning." But what she had won was a front-row seat to someone else's ruin. Derek, too, sat alone in his duplex, surrounded by boxes of paperwork, half-drunk whiskey, and a silence that now mocked him. He opened his laptop, scrolled through old photos of himself and Marilyn, and stared at one where she was laughing with her eyes closed, before Chloe ever existed. He didn't delete it. He didn't save it either. He simply stared, haunted not by the loss of a marriage, but by the memory of a woman who had once seen him as more than he ever deserved. The morning after the final verdict, Marilyn woke to the sound of birds chirping at her window, not the shrill, startled cries of crows, but the mellow harmony of sparrows in conversation. It had been years since she heard them clearly, perhaps because she had lived so long beneath the fog of worry that nature's song had grown faint. She sat up slowly, the sheets still warm with the memory of restful sleep, real sleep, not the kind chased with sedatives or interrupted by dreams laced in betrayal. She rose, wrapped herself in a cotton robe, and walked barefoot to the balcony where her potted hibiscus plant stood in bloom, untouched by the dust of the week's chaos. The morning sun spilled across her compound gently, casting gold across her walls, like a quiet promise that life, though bruised, was still capable of color. In her hand was a cup of tea, not brewed in anger, not stirred with sorrow, but made for the simple pleasure of morning. She sat on the wooden bench her father carved before he died and looked ahead, not at anything specific, but at everything that no longer weighed her down. A car passed slowly down the street. Children chased a rubber tire along the gutter, and an elderly woman selling roasted yam barked a price at no one in particular. Life had returned to being ordinary, and for the first time in years, ordinary felt like luxury. Tammy visited later that afternoon with a small parcel in hand. Inside it was a framed newspaper clipping. Court grants full asset restitution to estranged wife in high-profile Elm Creek case. The photo was from the courtroom, a candid shot of Marilyn standing beside Tammy, not posing, just existing with dignity that no camera could capture entirely. "I know you don't like noise," Tammy said with a grin, "but I thought you should keep a reminder of how quietly you burned the whole lie to the ground." Marilyn chuckled and accepted it, placing it beside the bookshelf in her reading corner. They talked for hours, mostly about things unrelated to Derek or courtrooms or Chloe. They discussed books, travel, and how peace is the one thing people only value when they've lost it. As Tammy got up to leave, she paused at the door and said, "You know, I've seen women break after less, but you taught me something about restraint." Marilyn didn't respond with words. She just smiled, the kind of smile that didn't beg for acknowledgement but offered it. When the door closed behind Tammy, Marilyn stood for a while, staring at the faint handprint Chloe had left on her front gate weeks ago when she had followed Derek home drunk, demanding to be let in. The mark was fading now, almost invisible, but Marilyn didn't wipe it off. She let it fade naturally, like every other scar she had chosen not to pick at. Elsewhere in town, Derek sat in his office, or what remained of it. Half the staff had resigned since the trial ended, clients had pulled out of pending deals, and contractors now hesitated to return his calls. He still wore a suit each morning, but his reflection in the glass panels didn't return the same man. His voice cracked when he answered the phone. His shoulders slouched under the invisible burden of disgrace. He had tried reaching out to Chloe again, sending apology messages that sounded more like confessions than comfort. She hadn't replied. His mother, once his staunch defender, had called him a fool last week, not out of anger, but with the weary disappointment of someone who raised him to build, not destroy. He opened his email and saw yet another message from a bank, demanding clarification on assets now under legal review. The noise of failure had become a rhythm in his life. He thought about Marilyn often, not the courtroom Marilyn, but the one who used to leave handwritten notes in his briefcase, reminding him to eat, to breathe, to dream bigger. He had destroyed something sacred not out of necessity, but out of arrogance. Chloe had been an escape, yes, but also a mirror, one that showed him only the version of himself that craved admiration, not growth. Now, with all the applause gone, he sat in silence, replaying every laugh he and Chloe shared in that courtroom, each one now echoing like the cry of a man who had celebrated his own funeral. Marilyn spent the next few weeks decluttering, not just her home, but her life. She sold the car that Derek once insisted they buy on loan, donated clothes she no longer felt like herself in, and painted her bedroom a soft shade of blue. She didn't share updates online. She didn't call old friends to retell the drama. She simply rebuilt in silence. At night, she lit candles in her living room, not for ambience, but as a quiet ritual of rebirth. The flickering light reminded her that survival wasn't the goal. Living fully, on her own terms, was. She began sketching again, something she abandoned years ago. The first thing she drew was a woman standing on a hilltop, arms raised, hair blowing in the wind. There was no caption beneath the sketch, only a date. On a warm Sunday morning, she received a package without a sender name. Inside was a letter from Chloe, handwritten, no insults, no excuses, just a paragraph that read, "I mocked you in court because I mistook silence for weakness. Now I understand that only a strong woman can be quiet in the face of noise. I'm sorry, not for losing him, but for not recognizing your strength." Marilyn read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in her drawer. She didn't reply. There was no need. Her reply was already written in the life she was now living, in the strength she carried like perfume, subtle but unmistakable. In the end, she didn't need to shout. The judgment spoke for her. And those who once laughed at her? They cried without anyone asking them to. Marilyn's story reminds us that silence is not always weakness, and dignity is not the absence of pain, but the decision to rise above it. In a world that claps the loudest for noise, learn to clap quietly for yourself. You don't always need to shout your truth. Just live it, prove it, and protect it. There is a kind of strength in staying composed while people are clapping for your fall, not knowing that you're just bending to pick up proof. If someone mocks you while you're hurting, don't rush to fight with fire. Just gather your facts, protect your peace, and walk in wisdom. Let your calmness be your courtroom, your growth be your witness, and your peace be your judgment. Remember, not every betrayal is a loss. Some are instructions. Sometimes God allows the door to slam shut just so you can realize you had the key all along. Let your healing be louder than their gossip. Let your restoration be their confusion. Let your silence teach lessons no argument ever could. Heavenly Father, for every soul listening who has been mocked in pain, dismissed in silence, or overlooked in betrayal, I ask you to step in and speak for them. Give them the grace to carry dignity even when insulted, to remain calm when provoked, and to trust that you see what men try to hide. Lord, when the crowd claps for their downfall, let heaven stand for their rise. When people laugh at their struggle, let you prepare a table that no enemy can sit at. Let every loss become a lesson, every scar become a story of survival, and every delay become a setup for destiny. Give them wisdom to wait, strength to stand, and peace that passes all understanding. Silence every mocking voice, and replace every tear with unstoppable joy. Heal their heart, order their steps, and bless them so richly that even their enemies become confused. We declare that what was meant to break them will build them. What was designed to humiliate them will elevate them. And where they were once mocked, they will be marveled at. In the name of the one who fights battles in silence and wins without noise. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.